Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We had a bit of a rocky start, but hopefully things will go smoothly from here on in. I am Holly Moskerance, the Community Programs Outreach Manager for the National Association of Realtors, and I manage NAR's placemaking program and our Rural Outreach Initiative, which provides resources and assistance to our small realtor associations and to associations serving rural communities. Today's webinar, which is part of our Rural Outreach Initiative, will focus on the topic of broadband, or lack of, in rural communities and some of the advocacy efforts underway, including within our realtor community, to bridge this digital divide. We will be doing things a bit different today. We will have a moderator who will give you an overview of the broadband issue, and then we will hear from each of our speakers in a question and answer format as to what is happening in their communities and how their realtor associations are helping to bring broadband to their communities. If you have a question during the webinar, please type it into the box on the bottom right hand of your screen, and we will try to get to it as time permits. Starting things off will be Christopher Mitchell, who will be our moderator, and he is the director of the Community Broadband Networks at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Christopher is a leading national expert on community broadband networks and speaks at conferences across the United States on the subject. He was honored as one of the top 25 in public sector technology by Government Technology in 2012. On a day-to-day basis, Christopher runs muninetworks.org, the comprehensive online clearinghouse of information about community broadband. He has published 3 in-depth case studies of citywide publicly owned gigabit networks and has released the Community Broadband Map, a comprehensive map of the community-owned networks. Helen Hostley is a Chief Executive Officer for the Vermont Association of Realtors. Helen is known for her ability to get things done with expertise as a project manager powerhouse. Throughout her career, she has worked with stakeholders across public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Helen has proven abilities in navigating not only the intricacies of government agencies, but also the labyrinth of grassroots community involvement. Demonstrating her skills in knowing how to mobilize unconnected people and create effective programs, she established a framework for donations management for the state of Vermont during a declared disaster and designed communication strategies which resulted in the passage of critical bonds for Vermont schools. Elizabeth Peets is the Vice President of Government Affairs for Colorado Realtors. She is a licensed attorney in Colorado, Nebraska, and Washington, D.C. She was a legislative assistant for Representative Scott McInnes and has worked in legal analysis and government affairs for more than 12 years. At CAR, she directs the association's efforts on public policy, as well as manage its government affairs division. Besides advocacy and legislative work, Elizabeth oversees the Realtors Legislative Policy Committee, candidate endorsement process, and its political action committee. As Vice President of Government Relations for the Mississippi Realtors, Clark Wise serves as the association's chief lobbyist. In this role, Clark monitors all legislative and regulatory activity that impacts the business of real estate, promotes grassroots political advocacy, and is the staff liaison to the association's Legislative and Regulatory Affairs Committee, MARPAC, and the Issues Mobilization Committee. While in Washington, D.C., Clark worked for U.S. Senator Thad Cochran. Before moving to Mississippi, Clark served as a consultant to Mississippi Conservative PAC, where he helped to re-elect Senator Thad Cochran. Clark's Mississippi experience includes serving as Director of Development for the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, serving as a Northeast Regional Field Director for the Mississippi House Republican Caucus, and most recently serving as Government Relations Associate for the Mississippi Hospital Association. And lastly, Susan Gaston is the founder and president of the Gaston Group, LLC. She is a Virginian-based government relations and public affairs consultant, offering over 2 decades of experience in public policy, legislative affairs, grassroots and grasstops advocacy, media and public relations, business development, and analytics. Susan developed the Government Affairs Program for the Virginia Peninsula Association of Realtors and the Williamsburg Area Association of Realtors, and she continues to represent both associations as their contract guide. In addition, Susan represented the Greater Piedmont Realtors for 6 years, where she was very involved in issues regarding broadband and rural communities. So let's get started, and I'm going to turn things over to Christopher to give us a broadband overview.
Thank you. This is a real treat because I don't think you have any sense of how much many of us who work in the broadband field have wanted to have real estate, the power of real estate agents, your groups working on this issue. So it's really great to make all your acquaintance, and I certainly hope this is the beginning of a lot of work together. Let me see if I can. I think I was made the presenter, but I'm not seeing the buttons to advance the slide.
I could do it if you could just do it actually any way you would advance a slide on your laptop or computer, but I could certainly do it as well.
I'm not seeing that I have the controls. So if you wouldn't mind moving forward, that would be great.
Okay, I'm having troubles, but if you could speak, I'll try to catch up to you.
Okay. So the first slide, actually, a lot of my slides are pictures, and the first one is of other utilities that we're already familiar with. My goal is generally not to put you to sleep by talking about the incredible difference between megabits, megabytes, gigabits, and all that, but rather to talk about this in a way that will resonate with anyone, because y'all shouldn't have to learn that. I often say that I don't have to turn off my lights in order to use my toaster. And I think that's a key concept that we should be thinking about. People should be able to go to the store, purchase devices, and be confident it will work on their home internet connection. That's the direction that we want to be going. There's nothing really to stop us from doing that, frankly, except for, I think, a little bit of history, but some good policy can really move us in the right direction. And so, we don't want to get into a debate, I think, as to what a utility is. It actually isn't all that helpful if we do win that debate. But the point is more that broadband should be working like the things we're already familiar with that don't require me to know what an amp is to be able to use it to full effect. There's a definition for broadband that the FCC uses, the Federal Communications Commission, and it's 25 megabits down, 3 megabits up. But the important thing to recognize is that this is for a household. Sometimes people will start talking about which apps they use, and the way the Federal Communications Commission defines what is broadband is based on what a household uses. And so many households have many devices, and it's worth thinking about it in those terms. That particular connection of 25 megabits down, 3 megabits up is better. It's a little bit slower than the average cable connection and a little bit better than the average DSL connection. So generally, if you're thinking about homes that have fiber optic connection or a cable connection, they're going to have very fast speeds typically. DSL will typically be slower. Satellite is something that has a whole host of problems that we don't even consider it broadband generally, even if it can deliver faster speeds in certain circumstances. So that's sort of the conceptual thought about broadband, and the part to remember, I think, is that this is a moving target over time. As technology improves, people do need more of it because the devices that they use will use more of it. So the next part is where I talk a little bit about my organization. I'm from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and we're a 45-year-old nonprofit. But the part that I think you'd be more interested in is that we've been doing for 15 years internet access policy. What can communities do to improve themselves? That's what I'm the most expert in, although I've been dabbling in state and federal increasingly over the years because all of this is interrelated. And our goal is to make sure that everyone has high-quality internet access so that they can have maximal opportunity for education, for jobs, for telemedicine, for all kinds of things that require that educational connection. One of the the things that we do is really focused on educating people on this stuff. And so we have a screenshot that I think you can't see of our website, muninetworks.org, which is short for Municipal Networks, so MUNI networks.org. Has a whole bunch of resources, videos. I do a podcast. I think a lot of you are in the car, probably more than you'd like to be. And so we talk about a lot of these issues, sometimes at details that could put you in danger of running off the road. But this is a good place to go into if you're looking for fact sheets or you want to get more informed. That's a good place to get started. When we start talking about where broadband is available, this is a contentious issue. The federal government has attempted to map it, but has not done a very good job, to the point at which nobody really wants to defend the maps that are available, and we are spending billions of dollars every year based on those maps. So there's a strong push to improve them, and there's just been some action to improve them. Oh, great. If you want to go to the next slide, will be terrific. And right now, there's a discussion over how best to improve them, but I think that a lot of this is actually moving in a good direction. This Federal Communications Commission, which is one that I tend to criticize more than I tend to approve of, I think they're doing a terrific job in terms of moving in a better direction for mapping. I don't think we'll have that data for a year or more, but when we do start to get it, it'll be much more accurate. To date, something you may be familiar with is that we only know if a census block has broadband effectively. And we don't even know that to a really high degree of confidence. But increasingly, we'll know which homes on the street have access. So one of the issues that we have is that if you look at the federal maps, it suggests that only 25, maybe 19 million, 25 million, maybe 30 million, depending on the data set you're looking at, have no access to broadband. Microsoft used its unique capacity as a company that is frequently interacting with its customers across the internet to measure their speeds, and it found that about half of Americans, even if they are subscribing to a broadband connection, the speed that they're actually using is much slower. And this lines up with data that Netflix has collected, YouTube has collected, and other sites like Amazon as well have seen this. And so one of the issues to be aware of is that there's a lot of gray areas when we're talking about broadband between what's available at the home, what we actually know is available at the home, and then also what equipment may be degrading that in some way, or if it's been over-advertised. So I think for your purposes, you'll be most interested in knowing where there's high-speed access. And unfortunately, we can't tell you that with a high degree of certainty, although certainly if you're dealing with a home that has cable access, they're most likely going to have the higher quality of access, whereas DSL or can often be quite slow, may even disappear with something that is quite technical, where a homeowner may sell and then the new homeowner may not be able to connect to that same DSL connection anymore. But the third thing you may hear about is wireless and fixed wireless. Fixed wireless is a way of providing a connection that's similar to our mobile devices, but has a device on the side of the house that allows them to use a similar network. Providers there are doing a great job in some places, and in other places they're doing a terrible job. So I really sympathize for people who are struggling with this technology, because just knowing what type of technology connection uses may not tell you as much as you need to know in terms of the quality. But what we certainly have seen, and we can go on to the next slide here, is that the broadband increases values to properties, and fiber optics even more so. And increasingly, people do know the difference between broadband and fiber. This is a slide that looks at the multifamily homes. And I had this more for future reference than having you read it right now, but the point is that surveys suggest that people are asking for fiber optics, not just broadband, and that they're willing to pay more for it. The next slide looks at as well different measure from the same group. A lot of these measures are from a company called RVA, which works frequently with the Fiber Broadband Association, which also would love to share their information with you, I have no doubt, because they're very interested in promoting the value of fiber. So they've studied this, and they've done these studies to look at the value of the having the fiber optics. And so you need to discount a condominium about 3.4% in order for a person to value it similarly to a fiber home, which is to say that, or if you're looking at the rent, it's 9%, which is to say that if you have the identical rooms, identical homes in these condominiums, having a fiber connection is worth about 9% additional value. The home price for that sort of situation is 4%. Now, this data is more recent than the next slide, which is my last slide on the value, which is a study which was, I think, the most rigorous academically, which came out of a partnership between Colorado State and Carnegie Mellon, where they found that fiber optics would add $5,437 to a $175,000 home. And that was valued at the time at being roughly worth a fireplace or half a bathroom. At this point, I think the difference is much larger, but it's more, I think, in that homes without broadband have probably subtracted in value as opposed to homes with broadband necessarily gaining in value. And so we see a definite change. One of the things that I've seen with my own eyes is here in the Twin Cities. I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota. There's an area, roughly a third of the city now has fiber optic access via a local company that does a great job, has a terrific reputation. And regularly people will ask only to see homes in areas that are served there. And that's true both for people who are moving within the city, where they just wouldn't even contemplate moving to an area outside of there. Every home in Minneapolis has access to very high quality Comcast services, compared to what you might expect in lower quality broadband homes. But people really value that fiber optic connection from the local company that keeps it affordable. The next study, or the next slide, is actually, I think this is actually the last one on that, which is a vacation home. This is for Door County, Wisconsin. Again, 5-6 years ago, the study found that this very popular vacation destination in northeast Wisconsin on Lake Michigan is adds quite a bit of value to have high-quality internet access. We've seen other studies in northern Wisconsin suggesting that people would spend an extra week or two on average in the communities where they have cabins and things like that if they had better internet access there. And of course, you will always get the person or two who will say, I don't want it there, I want to get away. But on average, we see people want this sort of coverage. If we can go on to the next slide, I want to highlight something. This is a new fact sheet that will be coming out very soon from us. So you're getting kind of a little preview. But the point is, many of you may have heard, and I don't hope that you're not going to try and read all this on the slide, but you can get this fact sheet soon. There's this thing called 5G, which is the next iteration of wireless services for our phones. It's actually going to take many years to deploy in a way that will be meaningful for us. Some are, I believe, disingenuously claiming that this will solve the problem, whether you're talking about competition in urban areas or access in areas that do not have good access today. The way that technology works, there will not be a lot of homes that currently don't have broadband which will suddenly have an affordable 5G service. And to the homes that do have 5G service, which are homes that will overwhelmingly already have high quality broadband, relying solely on 5G may not be much more realistic than relying on a 4G LTE today. Bandwidth caps will likely continue to be a challenge for homes that want to stream a lot. And so when you hear all this 5G hype or you see it in the media, I would consider that to be akin to just marketing claims that are designed to sell devices as opposed to stand up under scrutiny. I wouldn't really count on it. Next slide, please. So one of the things I want to talk about is what's happening around the country, and that is rural areas actually have better access than you might expect. Particularly in the upper Midwest, the electric co-ops and particularly the telephone co-ops have made a lot of investment in fiber optics. This is data that's nearly 2 years old now, and there's a lot more of this that's been deployed since. But all of those purple areas, which for people who aren't watching, it's 80% of North Dakota, it's like 70% of 60% of South Dakota, a lot of the upper Midwest, a significant swaths of Montana, even Texas and West Texas, they already have fiber optic service. And so you should think of this as being high quality internet access. You don't get higher quality than fiber optic. This is already available in many rural areas, and if you go 10 miles away from that, the people may have nothing. And so we're increasingly seeing a great divide, even in rural America, between people who may have some of the best service. People in North Dakota that have no neighbors for 5 miles have better internet access than I can get in St. Paul, Minnesota. So there's a lot more investment than people necessarily realize, and we're doing better in some regions. The next slide, please. We have more than 500 local governments that have built their own local governments using a variety of methods. They are trying to overcome a variety of problems, from just encouraging economic activity to trying to bring high quality internet access to every home. There's roughly 110 communities that have citywide fiber optic service from the local government. This is something, you can go on to the next slide. This is something that is controversial in some circles, but most Americans believe that this decision should be made by the community. And so there's ongoing fights in state legislatures and sometimes at the federal level over whether local governments should get into this game to try to improve internet access. And that's quite a significant dispute among the cable and telephone companies who are very opposed to it. But most Americans think the decision should basically be made locally based on local situations. Now, the next slide discusses one way in which a local government has decided to do this, and that's a township in Michigan which just increased taxes to pay for it after a referendum. It'll be on average $20 a month of additional taxes to finance a fiber optic network to everyone. This is an area that has very poor service. Very few people have broadband. The cost of the way they're doing it will unfortunately fall heavier on farmers and people that own a lot of land. But this is something that was overwhelmingly supported. And we've seen this in a few other places. And there's other places that we could name in which, if there was a vote, it would overwhelmingly fail because people don't want to use their property taxes for that. The next slide, please. So I'm going over a couple of different ways that we're seeing local policies that solve this. One is something called partnerships, which I think tends to be inflated a bit more than we've actually seen in practice. But we did a study or a report on the ones we thought were the most successful, where cities would make a significant investment and then work with a local provider often to deliver access. That's a method that I think we haven't seen a lot on, but we're going to see a lot more of in coming years as we see the capital capacity, the way that local governments can borrow money, can then work with private sector providers who would be able to operate on a network that the local government may not be comfortable operating in that manner. The next slide moves on to it's a little video that we did looking at how one town in Idaho has approached this. This is an approach that is taking off. We're seeing other communities consider it. And this is where the network actually is supports multiple providers. And so in this case, local residents would band together and create improvement districts that would be used to finance the fiber, and then the fiber would be available to multiple competitors. It's quite popular in Ammon. There's other cities that have used different financing models, but also build one network that is available to multiple competitors. This is usually called open access, and it's quite popular in theory because it operates like our roads. which is to say we have one set of roads and commerce occurs over them. So when we're thinking about this, and particularly when we're talking about different policies, whether they're state, local, or federal, it's important to note that one sector of them is aimed at making sure that any investment that's made would be open to multiple providers, so we're not using taxpayer dollars to create monopoly service providers. The next slide, please. This next slide actually shows this is a network in Utopia, called Utopia in Utah. This is a network that for many years was considered a total failure, even by their own standards, and not just those who continue to oppose it from ideological reasons. They made a lot of mistakes. They were kind of trailblazers in this approach, and in recent years they have corrected those. They're doing much better. They're rapidly expanding right now, and people can have access to their choice of providers here in offering services that are some of the best in the country for the value of how much they pay versus what they get. And then my last slide with content is just a sort of a sense. People think of fiber optics as expensive, and that's because it's expensive, but it always depends on what you compare it to. If you're looking at the cost of light rail, or even of just like the cost of maintaining our roads, you can build a lot of fiber for those costs. Fiber optics is expensive, but it's much less expensive than water systems, than electric systems. And so something to keep in mind as you're working on these issues, and I think joining our goal of having everyone connected and making sure that anyone who moves into a home will have the same access to high quality education and medicine and all of that. This is something that's affordable when we get it right. It's not something that is so expensive we couldn't do it. So my last slide has my contact information. Certainly we can share, I'm happy to share these slides with anyone who is interested. But now we're going to move on to hear more from the panelists. I'd like to start by moving on to Elizabeth, asking her to tell us about, all of a sudden I've lost my cheat sheet of which state Elizabeth's from. I'm sorry. Colorado, yes, which is a wonderful state for all these things I've been talking about. Municipals, co-ops, really great local providers, cooperatives. Colorado has a lot going for it. So thank you, Elizabeth. Tell us what's going on there.
Thank you, Chris. That was really great information. Yes, in Colorado, we have been very active on the broadband issue. Over the last 2 years, we have been, as a Realtor Association, involved in 3 pieces of state legislation. And just to sort of give you a starting point, about 85,000 households, which is 14% of Colorado households, were known to have slow or no broadband. So in 2018, one of the first pieces of legislation that we worked on was a Senate bill to finance rural broadband deployment. A little bit of a quirk of state law, but our Public Utilities Commission within the Department of Regulatory Agencies is able to provide financial assistance to telecom companies that provide basic landline service in rural areas. And it's funded by a surcharge on voice service. Of course, most mobile providers now are charging on data, not voice. But that fee, which we call the high cost support mechanism, that fee was what we started working with to actually get broadband funded. So essentially, that Senate bill phases the reallocation of that voice fee for landline infrastructure and the providers that provide that, and then allocates that instead to broadband infrastructure and reimbursing those providers that provide that. So, of course, it was very controversial, giving one financial pot of money over to another group, but the bill was bipartisan and really led by our governor and by our state legislature, because we, like many states, have a lack of coverage in those rural areas. We're not worrying about Denver, but we're thinking about the Durangos and the Grand Junctions. And we had a very engaged membership on the issue. One of our realtors testified At the time, that was 1 in 4 rural households that lacked broadband access. So that bill passed, the governor signed that one, and then we also had a fairness bill in 2018. It's called literally Broadband Deployment Leveling the Playing Field, but it requires our Broadband Deployment Board to consider criteria such as the speed and the cost when telecom companies invoke that right of first refusal for a competitor. They have to consider how fast is the speed and how much does it cost for consumers. So those were really important for our members. And then in 2019, we had a third bill, which is our Broadband Infrastructure Installation Bill. And this is a bill that we actually opposed at the outset in the first draft of the bill. And really what we were worried about most is we believe in the infrastructure of broadband being funded and implemented, but we didn't want it to be at the cost or harm to property owners who have electric utility easements. So this bill provided notice provisions for installing and maintaining broadband, clarified some of the statute of limitations and damages in case there was an injury to property, and then outlined the obligations and duties of the utilities, the commercial broadband suppliers, and property owners. And I think we'll get into this a little bit later in the webinar, but what we did was work with a broad coalition of stakeholders to make amendments to the bill, and we ultimately ended up being able to support the bill once those amendments were made. So, and that was as a result of us taking advantage of some NAR resources. Some of the concerns that we had with the draft of this 2019 legislation were, again, like I said, the damages. Were they going to be, or remedy, were they going to be nominal, or were they going to really make property owners whole? And then if you have an easement right to enter, does that mean your rights to have your property and the use of your property maintained, once they go in and install it, can they just come back again and again and damage your property? And so we were able to make those amendments. And I'm happy to say that after those 3 sets of pieces of legislation, Colorado is now on track to reach 92% by this June in our rural communities. So we're going to have 96% coverage of Colorado's 2 million households, and urban Denver is about 99.94%. So I can say that this has been a really successful model for us and for our realtors. So happy to talk a little bit more, but want to give a chance to our other panelists to talk about their experiences.
Okay, so I don't know if we lost Christopher or not, but
I'm sorry, I was just
he's
talking
there. Okay.
Talking to myself on mute.
I've done that before.
Elizabeth, thank you for that. I thought it was it's terrific, and you brought up the easements in particular. That's something that many states still have to wrestle with, and so making sure that they have an equitable solution. It's good to know that that we can get there. Clark, can you fill us in on what's happening in Mississippi, please?
Absolutely. So we started talking, we began before we set our legislative priorities for every session, we travel the state, we visit with every one of our local boards, and the common theme we heard on those was difficulty, whether it was in our residential folks, commercial, lack of access to high-speed internet across the state. And I was so curious, looking at some of those slides, Mississippi was clearly a digital desert in that sense. And so when we started talking to those board members, we worked with public service commissioners on this issue. We started looking at other states. That's one of our best resources is we look at what others have done, what's gone well, what could be improved. And we saw Alabama had a model where they were allowing their electric power associations or their electric cooperatives to get into the internet business. And I'll tell you, when we started looking at Mississippi state law, we have our major utility companies, our electric power providers, and we have our co-ops. We have 25 of them across the state. We had it in our state law that those electric cooperatives were only permitted to provide electric power to their individuals or to their customers. Now, when we started looking at this and we looked at other states that were allowing those electric cooperatives to provide high-speed internet services or broadband in this instance, we started looking at that may be the best way for Mississippi to help address the problem. And so when we started talking to these co-ops, they were on board with introducing legislation. Now, I will tell y'all, and we can discuss it in greater detail, the realtors were very clear from the beginning that, our position on it is we view ourselves as property professionals and community champions. And our role in advancing and expanding the role of access to high-speed internet is purely to help connect communities, provide livable communities, and improve the quality of life for all Mississippians. We're not there to talk about pole attachment rates. We're not there to identify, what's the best mechanism. Is it burying it under the ground? Is it hanging it to the poles? And so that was what we told them. We said we have a large network of members that are active and engaged in their communities. And what we ended up doing was partnering with the electric cooperatives of Mississippi, Farm Bureau Federation, the Mississippi Poultry Association, and AARP. And that's a pretty large coalition when you look at it. And I'll tell y'all, the bill and the drafting of that, we were able to provide anecdotal support from our members across the state that say, hey, we've had issues moving, real estate. We may have young people that are looking to move to Mississippi, but they want a job where they can, work remotely. We're looking at expanding telemedicine capabilities, and that's something that's going to be crucial for our residents. And then even educational distance learning opportunities. Realtors, as everybody on this call knows, realtors are so engaged and involved in all aspects of community development. We saw as a perfect role for us to fill in this manner. And so I will tell you, when working with the co-ops, we helped identify legislation that would allow these 25 electric cooperatives, if they chose to provide the service, the high-speed internet service, to their customers, they were free to do so. Now, the caveats in the bill really dealt with more consumer protection provisions for the individuals. Specifically, there was concern from the legislature that electric cooperatives, as was discussed earlier, this is an expensive endeavor. And so the electric cooperatives would have to make sure that this would be a viable option financially, and that any expansion of services outside of electric power would not be put on the backs of the current ratepayers. And so that was really the sticking point, number one. Number two, the other sticking point was, as we mentioned, the pole attachment rates. You have your larger utility companies, your AT&Ts, your Comcasts, and all that, they were concerned that it's great that we have these electric cooperatives that have an infrastructure in place to provide these services to these rural communities. And if we're going to have a chance to rent space on that pole, we want to make sure that we're not going to be charged at an exorbitant rate compared to should the cooperative decide to offer the service themselves. And I will tell y'all, in discussing with the cooperatives, they're telling the realtors and the others involved, look, there are some of those 25, there are some that have already conducted feasibility studies and are ready to go. There are several of them that they are waiting for legislation to pass before they take next steps about getting into the broadband business. And there were about 4 or 5 that said, even if this legislation moves, we're not sure that this is our, aligns with our mission. And so I will tell you, when the bill was introduced on January 14th, we reviewed the language, we signed off on it. It had those provisions for the consumer protection, which was important from the realtor's perspective. That bill was introduced on the 14th, passed on the 15th, sent to the other side, to the Senate, on the 16th. It was brought up and passed on the 21st, and then it was returned to be signed on the 24th, and it was signed into law on the 30th. So that is really a true example of working together, getting our ducks in a row ahead of time, and recognizing our role from the realtor's perspective. And I'll tell you, I can go into when we discuss later about kind of our advocacy program to deploy and pass that bill. But when we are identifying the role of the realtors in any legislative scenario, we have a set of standing principles and priorities. And I'll just tell you, when we looked at expanding internet access, it polled at 84% among our members. We had at that time about 6,000 members, and we had around 1,600 responses. So that is a really popular, it was the highest polling item on our agenda for that year, so we made it our #1 priority. And so when we were asked, at the beginning, why is this something the realtors are interested in, we were able to point directly to our role, which is realtors believe communities flourish when they offer a high quality of life at a reasonable cost. Livable communities offer a variety of affordable housing choices, nearby employment opportunities, economically viable commercial sector, great schools, and infrastructure that all provide the framework for the quality of life we enjoy in our communities. To promote the livable communities, the government should encourage quality growth by amending outdated laws that prohibit electric cooperatives from providing high-speed internet access to rural areas of Mississippi. So from Mississippi's standpoint, we were able to accomplish the goal of working to bridge the digital divide, not costing any additional state dollars for this. It would totally be on those entities. It didn't require a tax increase, which was a non-starter in a supermajority Republican legislature. And I'm pleased to report at this point, when that bill was signed, it was so crucial to get it done quickly because there was going to be federal money available. And I actually spoke with the government affairs person for the electric cooperatives, and I'm told that all 25 of our co-ops have conducted feasibility studies on providing broadband internet. And of the roughly 70 applicants of the USDA's Reconnect funds, that federal money, 17 were electric co-ops, and 4 of those were Mississippi electric cooperatives. And so winners of those grants are going to be announced in the coming months. And then perhaps most significantly, since the Mississippi Broadband Enabling Act was passed, we've seen our existing for-profit providers, our AT&Ts and Comcast, expanding their service to the territories. So from the Mississippi Realtors perspective, we were serving our purpose to help connect these communities, get the discussion started, and really work to bridge the digital divide that exists in our state.
Excellent. Thank you, Clark. I hate to try to jump in and shush people along when they're providing such great information. We just have a tight timeline here, so I'm going to hustle over to Helen, talk a little bit about Vermont. There's a lot of good things happening in Vermont. I've been following that for a lot of years, so let's get an update on that, Helen.
Well, I'm glad to think that you think that we are having a lot of great things happening in Vermont. Sometimes it feels like it's at a glacial pace. So this year, for the first time in many, many years, the Senate finally took up the broadband bill. For a lot of years, the State House they passed a lot of broadband bills because they realized the importance of having, similar to what Clark said in Mississippi, it's vital to the communities these days, just as vital as having good roads. And because our real estate market in many parts of the state really depend on connectivity. And so, we had what we had called dinner at home, where we invited our legislatures over to our building and we provided them dinner and had a chance to sit around in an informal setting and just talk about our main issues this year, which were broadband, housing affordability, and then a legislation around our regulatory construction and building industry. Which is Act 250, environmental stuff. But what was interesting is the chair of the broadband bill in the House says, we've been doing this for 5 years and it's just been sitting on the wall the whole time because the Senate refuses to take it up because of, just a small increase in the tax. And, so
where the realtors came in is in alliance with AARP also, because we realized, with our aging population in Vermont, they're a natural ally to a lot of the things that we're talking about in the State House, and how we can service our seniors and actually bring in more people into Vermont. And we were able to, through our conversations with the legislators, to say, not just anecdotal, but really, we are losing real estate deals because of the fact that if person A wants to live in community Y and they realize that there is absolutely no broadband whatsoever, then that just, kills the deal right there. And coupled with that is, which was probably highly publicized, was that Vermont was offering $10,000 relocation money for those who want to work remotely but come in and live in the state of Vermont. And but that, although there was a lot of people who took advantage of that, what they realized when the places that they really wanted to live didn't have broadband, they just said, no, forget it. So we had that little bit of ammunition saying, let's all work together here and figure out how we can make this work. So the first time, and like I said, in many years, the Senate took it up, and they were really still waffling on the fence. But where the power of the realtors came in is that while our government affairs director was sitting in the Senate committee room, we had a targeted number of our realtor members call those legislatures as they're sitting there. And so the calls were coming in, the pages were delivering notes saying, we support this, we support this. So it was able to then get passed. So overall in Vermont, it's a $600 million problem. And, so what was allocated for this year was not even a close to that. It was like almost $1 million was established through this first initiative. And it'll be grants. About $700,000 of that will go to a grant program, and then $200,000 will go to a connectivity issue, and then $50,000 is dedicated to the Department of Public Service to access a feasibility study. So it's not even close to coming close to cracking the nut that we have here, but it's a step in the direction that hasn't been taken before. And so we're really encouraged by what we were able to accomplish this past legislative session and then continue to build on that. So that's what we're working on, through the fall before the legislature strikes up in January. It's like, what are our next steps here and how can we make this work and even, get better broadband beyond what we have now.
Thank you, Helen. Our final presenter is Susan, and Susan, you're going to be telling us a little bit about what's happening in Virginia, where, once again, it's not true that every state has a lot of things going on, but Virginia has had a couple that I've followed from afar that I've found were interesting and worth learning about. So please let us know what's happening there.
Sure. Thank you all. Happy to be on this afternoon. I will tell you that we're getting some pretty significant storms rolling through, so if you hear things in the background, it's probably Mother Nature, and I hope it does not impact our connection as we try to wrap this up. I know I'm last, but I'm also, I hope, bringing in a different perspective, perhaps that will be beneficial and maybe even appeal to the local GADs who are on the call. I wore those shoes for several years as a full-time GAD, so I know what you all deal with and how you interact with the state associations. So I do hope that this will provide some insight, and I think this is where Holly especially wanted me to provide some input. So a few years ago with the Greater Piedmont Realtors, which covers a jurisdiction that, for all of you who don't know Virginia or who aren't Virginians, that really is our wine country, it's our horse country, it's our farming communities that are up in the D.C. area, sort of right before you get into the District of Columbia. Beautiful rolling hills, particularly well known for being a strong tourism sector. So we were beginning to hear from our realtor members, much as Elizabeth and Helen both observed, that they were having frustrations with transactions being completed because of a lack of access to broadband. And I might want to make the distinction between unserved and underserved, and what we were really trying to focus on and what I've would offer is perhaps continuing to be the focus of Virginia is the unserved, those places in our Commonwealth that have acute lack of access to broadband, as opposed to the underserved, where I could even put myself in that category. Some days here in my county it works, some days not so much, which I hope won't be the case in a few minutes when the storm really gets bad. But we are hearing from our members that they were increasingly frustrated. We are hearing from our county officials that they were hearing from their constituents. And to Clark's point from earlier, realtors really are that first point of contact, and their Rolodexes extend very broad, and people come to our members wanting them to help find solutions. So our counties were coming to us saying, please help us find something. Not the exact solution, but help us bridge the discussion, and maybe you can bring a different variety of players to the table and have some sort of a common theme. We are also in the cusp of local elections. That particular time we had elections in 3 of 5 counties. We had a number of incumbents who were coming to us asking for some help. We were having candidates suggesting that it was becoming an election issue and that we needed to put a great deal of focus on that. And we did. We included broadband in our candidate questionnaire. What would you do to increase broadband access to the unserved areas of your counties? A very open-ended question, but one which elicited a great deal of response and feedback. And we are also hearing from our chambers and from other business leaders that we're so glad you all are now part of the discussion. Bring some people to the table and let's have a conversation. So having heard all of that repeatedly from a variety of stakeholders, we took the initiative and we actually used a smart growth grant from NAR. I don't know if Hugh Morris is on the phone, but that was very successful with his support in helping us to procure that appropriation from NAR. The association hosted a large broadband forum. It was held at one of the high school local auditoriums, and we had a number of different speakers. Our keynote speaker was Dr. Basil Gooden, who at the time was the state director of the USDA Rural Development Office and dealt considerably with a variety of different broadband issues from across the country. We also included the Virginia Agribusiness Council. They represent, much like Farm Bureau Federation, our farmers, but they also represented entities that are related to farming that go beyond just the tractors and the crops and the cattle and other livestock. We included then Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry, Todd Haymore, and other members of our cabinet were also invited, but at the time, Secretary Haymore did come up and participate in that particular forum. We had our county administrators from a variety of the different communities who were expressing those frustrations with us as to help us find solutions. We had school superintendents. We were dealing with localities where, and I'm sure this is not unique just to this community, it happens again even around here where I live, near in the community between Hampton Roads and Richmond, where children were fine to a point when they were at school in their desks. But once they leave to go home, there is no access. And so they are stuck without any ability to produce their work and continue their school after they leave the actual bricks and mortar. So we included our superintendents. Virginia also has an entity. It's rather quasi-public-private. It's called the the Center for Rural Virginia, and it really focuses on many of those issues that are brought into our rural communities, from sustainability to economics to healthcare. And we had their director be a participant and a panel member for our forum as well. And last, we included the medical director from the Office of Telemedicine at the University of Virginia, Dr. Karen Ruban. And she very much focused on the impacts of telemedicine and how it was becoming detrimental, even to the point of life versus death in some cases, without having access to reliable, accessible broadband deployment. So we had a very large turnout. We had over 200 people on a very rainy night in the middle of July come out and participate, including members of our House and Senate, at the time our delegation who participated as well. From that, if you look at the initial scope of having our forum, and really I think what we do best, what our members do best, is being the source of the source. We provide them the information. We provide them the resources. We give them opportunities to learn and to go do more on their own. And I think that really did promote a sense of, let's go find out what we can do throughout our 5-county region. Not long after that forum, there were elections, and a number of very, I would say, pro-broadband, pro-increase the unserved communities access were elected to several of our boards of supervisors. One county in particular took the initiative to take these stakeholders that we rather much identified through the realtor community and bring them around the table in a broadband advisory committee, which met every month over the course of about 18 months. Realtors did have a seat at the table. We were very vocal, making sure that we were focusing on the unserved populations. And much to Christopher's point from earlier, we were also paying very close attention to what was becoming a bit of a frustration and I would say a tension point between our localities and our providers. We did have a situation in Virginia where a locality, in essence, became the provider, took on a tremendous amount of debt. The authority that was created did not succeed. It was a very negative situation, a black eye on that particular community that has since become much more aware, and it also created a situation where we wanted to make sure in the Commonwealth that there was a private-public or public-private partnership between our localities and the providers so that our localities did not bear the enormous burden and the fiscal unpredictability of trying to be a provider itself. That was part of the role that the Realtor Association played during those 15 months of meetings at the local county initiative on their broadband advisory committee. They are continuing to push things forward, and all of our communities are working together to try to enhance that unserved point of access for our residents. I know we're coming close, Christopher. I think I just heard you sort of pop in, so I don't want to keep talking if there are questions, but I can certainly provide additional details if there is a desire to do so.
Thank you, Susan. You're actually leading right into the point I want to close with. I want to ask if there's questions. Encourage people, if they can, to put them in the chat. I'd be happy to try and deal with them as quickly as we can. But I also want to make sure that as you were finishing, Susan, you were discussing some of the resources that can be used, and I wanted to make sure that each of our speakers had a chance to highlight what the Realtor Association actions could be.
Sure, I can start. This is Liz in Colorado. One of the things we did to oppose legislation that we thought was harmful to property owners was take advantage of NAR's land use initiative. And unfortunately, our favorite firm, Robinson & Co., had a conflict, so they couldn't provide us local legal analysis. So then we applied for a issues mobilization grant to get legal analysis done. And that proved to be an amazing resource because it allowed us to work with the Bar Association, the rural electrics, and the home builders to make sure the legislation is crafted in the right way. And we couldn't have had such a successful persuasion experience without those NAR resources.
Thanks, Liz. Do we have any others in the we only have a couple of minutes left, so I appreciate you keeping that short, Liz. But I want to let Clark, Helen, Susan, Holly.
Yeah, I'll hop in here. In Mississippi, we use the NAR's Call for Action program using the Advocacy Everywhere software, and it was really crucial for us because, like I said, we were in a tight timeline from when the bill was introduced to when it needed to pass in order to best put those co-ops in a position to apply for those federal funds. And so we had a very tight turnaround on that. In our 3 days where we had that call for action launched, we had nearly 900 respondents to it. And so we did everything from Facebook posts, text messages. We used Realtor Party mobile alerts. So we really used as much as we could in as quick amount of time using all the Advocacy Everywhere programs.
Thank you. We have a specific question about this that I wonder if anyone could ask, which is how do local associations access grants from NAR to help with this local issue?
So this is Holly. So we have different staff folks that manage our different grants, and each of them have different criteria. But the best place to find all the information on all of our resources is the Realtor Party website. So it's realtorparty.realtor.org. And under Programs and Grants on the navigation menu, you will be able to see a drop-down menu. So Susan mentioned the Smart Growth Grant, which brought in expert speakers for a forum. Elizabeth mentioned the Issues Mobilization Grant, which that one is up there. We also did, we didn't get a chance to talk about our call for actions. I think Clark used a call for action, and that gives you the tools to get the word out to your members. We also have a grant for to elect candidates. We've heard a lot of talk today about candidates who support this, so yet that's another way. And I do see at 3 o'clock, so I am going to have Chris wrap things up.
Thank you. I hope this is something that has piqued your interest. This is something that we could have spent all day on and not finished. But this, a webinar of this length, there's a tremendous amount of stuff that was covered that was all very relevant. So I really want to thank the speakers because each of them has dealt with the real issues that we see people dealing with and elevated things that can make a real difference for improving internet access. So please join me in thanking everyone with a silent clap for our members and for our panelists, and I'll hand it back over to Holly. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you to all our speakers. I really appreciate it, and thank you for bearing with us with all those technical difficulties in the beginning. And also thank you to everyone who joined us. This issue is not going to go away. If you are in a rural area, I'm sure you're experiencing it, and NAR is here to help you. And also just wanted to let you know that we probably will be having a white paper on this topic the end of this year or early next year. So with that, I thank everyone, and have a great day.